Hello, Kristen.
Hi, Bill. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing a little bit better than folks in the Wisconsin State Legislature today.
They might be having a grand old time in Wisconsin for all you know.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you guys just won the Super Bowl. Like, enjoy it, you know?
It's high legislative drama. They might be having and I imagine we'll get to this in more detail a little bit, but it's very possible that both Republican and Democratic sides think they have the upper hand here.
Yes. I imagine both sides think they've got a big political winner.
But before we get to the drama in the Badger State, as we speak, the House is still working on its amendments to its version of the continuing resolution, which is what will need to be passed in order to keep the government's doors open after March 4th, when the current continuing resolution runs out. So by the time this airs, it will probably have been passed. And there's been a degree of friction within the Republican caucus on the scope of the cuts. How are conservative bloggers reacting to what's expected to be the final outcome of this bill and Boehner's stewardship of this whole process? Are they pleased that he is sort of letting the fur fly, letting the amendments go whichever which way? Or are they grumbling that he's not leading with a stronger hand, forcing the bigger cuts himself?
I think most of what I've seen regarding Boehner's leadership on spending issues, there was actually a post over at Red State earlier in the week that wasn't. It was basically voting to ensure that, and I want to make sure I get this right, but I believe it was a rule that would have sort of made it difficult to take funding away from things like Obamacare as a part of this, and the rule was not going to let that go through, and that was kind of upsetting to a lot of them. I think most of what I've seen focused on in terms of fiscal issues, the attention's all actually been on the budget. Haven't seen as much about the continuing resolution so much as people beginning to look at the budget that President Obama has put forward and sort of really long-term stuff. How are we going to deal with entitlements? What do we do about paying the interest on our debt and how that becomes such a huge portion of our spending years from now? So I've seen the sort of, if I had to say what percentage of posts I've seen are dealing with the continuing resolution versus the longer-term stuff, it's a lot more debate about the sort of long-term crisis.
Which is interesting, because I think probably on the left there's been more focus on the Republican spending cut bill than there's been on the president's budget. Not that the president's budget has been ignored, and they're sort of taking some hits from the left on that, which we can get to. But particularly when John Boehner this week said in response to the prospect of losing 200,000 federal jobs, quote unquote, so be it, that has sparked a lot of commentary as far as what kind of damage the proposed spending cuts would do. As Kristen Paris over at America Blog said, this from someone who talked a lot about job creation during the campaign, but has yet to introduce any bill to promote job creation. Bizarre rape and abortion issues have been the priority for Boehner and the GOP. If they cut more jobs, will we pay the taxes to maintain what's already been spent? You also had, Steve Bannon over at the Washington Monthly taking aim at the notion that some federal jobs aren't real jobs, this notion that what we're left is a House Republican caucus that isn't quite sharp enough to realize it's playing with fire, with the economy hanging in the balance. It picked an arbitrary number, came up with a spending cut plan to meet it, and the result is a policy that would deliberately put in upwards of 1 million Americans out of work. As to defend the policy, GOP spokespersons are left with non sequiturs, false starts, and gibberish. Let's go at the notion again. Boehner talked about the prospect of it being 200,000 jobs, new federal jobs that Obama created. That number is proven to be not true, and beyond that, Center for American Progress analysis saying that the cuts in spending would affect GDP to such a degree that you'd lose 1 million jobs. EPI put it at 700,000 jobs. But there seems to be this notion on the Republican side when you're talking about federal jobs that some of those don't count and those don't actually result in paychecks and feed people's families. So that notion's been on the left more. The notion this could lead to government shutdown has been up on the left more, because if they don't come to resolution on this by March 4th, there will be a shutdown. And the scope of cuts in this bill is big enough that it would seem hard to find the middle ground with the Senate Democrats once they pass their version of it. There isn't even on the right an exhilaration that a shutdown might be in the offing. There's still more.
I haven't really seen. I think the only sort of exhilaration I saw is there's a much touted quote from Chris Christie from the end of his speech at AEI this week, where his quote about government shutdown that some folks liked was, if you want to shut down government, that's fine. I'm going to get in those black SUVs, go to the governor's residence, go upstairs, open a beer, order a pizza, and watch the Mets. So that's governing. That's serious governing. Well, I think I don't think that the government. I think that it is wise that Boehner is looking at the short-term issue and not neglecting the longer-term context of we have to do something. And so, while as a political communications professional, if jobs are lost, so be it line is concerning. It's true. It would be lovely if money came for free and we could employ everyone in a well-paying government job, and had no unemployment as a result. But that's not reality. And so, kudos to Boehner for at least admitting, that sort of runs counter to the point that federal jobs don't count as jobs. Boehner has said if this means jobs are lost, so be it. He understands that, this may be, that in places where the stimulus was used as a stopgap to keep people employed, where state budget shortfalls and bad state fiscal management had led to, folks were going to be suffering without keeping spending at those levels, there are going to be consequences. So, kudos to Boehner for at least, he owns up to the unfortunate consequences. Now, the thought being, if we begin now by passing a continuing resolution that reduces spending, we are hopefully contributing to getting rid of our longer-term problems, which will create bigger economic consequences in the future.
Separate from this immediate issue with the continuing resolution, there is the matter of the president's budget, which was released on Tuesday. It's the right's been attacking him. They didn't tackle entitlements head on. The left is attacking him because he's engaging in discretionary spending cuts prematurely, in the view of some on the left. I take it where you're picking up the conservative blogosphere is a complaint that he is not doing, he's not laying out specific cuts in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid in the budget up front.
Well, there's sort of an interesting graphic that I saw posted on a blog, which was a building on fire, and it was Obama with a super soaker trying to put it out. That the budget didn't seem that it was a serious way. It didn't seriously address the crisis that we were facing. And the two big posts, I think, that really take Jay Carney, the new press secretary, to task for his performance in his first press secretary, is about this issue of paying the interest on the debt, and that the idea that there's a post called Obamaeconomics 101, Borrowing to Pay Debt Isn't Debt, by Ed Morrissey at Hot Air. And he said, so when does borrowing not create debt? Only in two instances, when one has no intention of paying it back and when Barack Obama does it. Jake Tapper asked new White House Press Secretary Jay Carney exactly how borrowing over $600 billion in the best year of Obama's 10-year budget projections somehow qualifies as A, balanced spending, or B, not adding to the national debt. And then there's this kind of awkward exchange, which ends with Jake Tapper saying, the president seems to think that borrowing money to pay interest on the debt is not adding to the debt. I don't understand that math. And Jennifer Rubin then has a post with a clip from Jay Carney as well. And she says, you have to sympathize just a bit with the White House's new press secretary, Jay Carney. He's being asked to defend the indefensible, namely the assertion that borrowing doesn't count in assessing whether we are adding to our debt. Watch for yourself. It is, in a word, embarrassing. And when the White House press corps is incredulous at the lack of honesty by the administration, you know just how badly the Obama team has stumbled. There's a pretty decent economic analysis by a blogger named Keith Hennessy, who takes the numbers. Go ahead.
He's a former Bush economic aide. He's not just a random blogger. He was literally in the Bush White House.
Yes, he takes the numbers straight from straight from the document. Like, he's not making assumptions or numbers of his own. And just says that when you compare the last 50 years with the next 50 years, it's really scary. That over the last 50 years, yes, we have sustained periods where we were spending more than we were bringing in. But the numbers were generally over that time frame, adjusting for inflation. They're staying pretty flat. And that when you then move into the next 50 years, it gets ugly. But I think the line that was most important, and something that Republicans ought to keep in mind too, is that the size of government, this is a quote from him, the size of government metric is often ignored. Washington fights about whether a policy, like the new healthcare laws, widens or narrows the gap, the deficit on this chart, without asking whether the policy shifts the lines, that being tax revenue and spending, up or down, and both things matter. And then what he also says is, what has changed is that we used to say this was a long-term problem. The financial crisis, economic recession, and the president's policies have eliminated this small amount of breathing room, and makes clear that the long-term problem begins now. That's a lot of what the tone of these blogs have been, that we are dealing with a serious problem, and that the budget shows that Obama does not take it as seriously as he needs to.
Are these bloggers noting that any Republican budget proposal will also add to the debt? There is no way to not add to the debt numerically without literally grinding everything to a halt.
I think the point here is that this is not a serious, it is not serious enough cuts to really address the problem. I mean, nobody's saying that next year we shouldn't borrow anything. I have not read anywhere that folks have said, we ought to not borrow any money at all. I mean, the idea is, the stimulus is out there. The hole has been dug, but that we need to begin being very serious about reforming our entitlements and making serious cuts. Maybe not grinding everything to a halt, but that this budget sort of represents like some nibbling around the edges to appear centrist without really making a serious effort at addressing long-term fiscal issues. I'm interested to hear what the left has to say.
Well, the left has a totally different, a take on this, but just to engage me a little bit, if I may.
Okay.
The president, just to take the president's words at face value, he is not arguing that this budget in and of itself solves long-term deficit issues. One thing to say that he's being disingenuous about, he is literally saying this budget only deals with, as far as cuts are concerned, in discretionary spending. I, the president, am telling you I think the long-term deficit issue is about healthcare costs. I think Social Security is a separate solvency issue that I think we should address. And I want to sit down with both parties and address those long-term issues. I don't think the best way to go about doing that is to lay out a plan up front and have it get picked apart. So I think that's different than having your head in the sand. That's saying, I understand what the problem is, and this is my approach to dealing with that. And to the extent that what's in his budget does reduce the deficit relative to baseline projections, that's certainly not the same as being completely detached from the issue. Now, the criticism on the left is that you're taking the deficit too seriously too quickly while the economy is still in a precarious state, that these discretionary spending cuts are trivial in the big scheme of things. That's sort of a point where I think almost everyone seems to agree to, whether you're the president or on the left or on the right, that these cuts are not where the issue is, and then it just comes down to, are they of symbolic importance? Are they a down payment, or are they just completely beside the point, which is what most of the left is saying. And you're having an additional issue because there's been news coverage that there's a bipartisan Senate group looking to take some form of the Simpson-Bowles Deficit Commission recommendations and put that into legislation to be dealt with before this debt ceiling issue comes to a head in the late spring. That is definitely putting the left on edge again. They were on edge before the State of the Union address, worried the president was going to embrace Social Security cuts right then and there, and he didn't, and so there was a bit of a sigh of relief. But now those anxiety alarms are coming again, and across the ideological spectrum within the left. You have Jamal Bowie on American Prospect, looking at the Wall Street Journal preview of a potential deal, which would cut discretionary spending by $1.7 trillion through 2020, but would only raise additional revenue by $180 billion in the next 10 years. So he said it's fair to say this is a terrible deal for Democrats. $180 billion in revenue over 10 years is paltry in comparison to $1.7 trillion in cuts to discretionary spending. A little more than 1% of the 2010 budget for discretionary spending, while the tax revenue part would be 1% of the discretionary budget, while the 1.7 trillion would be 12.5%. So it's a 12 to 1 ratio. And Jonathan Chait, who is probably one of the more deficit hawkish folks on the left, his headline was, "Are Democrats negotiating a monumentally stupid deficit deal?" That ratio could be much closer to 50-50 if it's going to be a real compromise. And David Dayan, Frederick Lake, generally an administration skeptic, saying, of course, a grand bargain would be tilted towards spending cuts. That's what. So he ends his post by saying, it's not a given there'll be any kind of grand bargain. Incidentally, John Boehner sounds pretty doubtful. Harry Reid is still adamant about protecting Social Security, and they're the two congressional leaders. So maybe nothing happens. But if it does, of course it'll be tilted towards massive spending cuts. That's what everyone in Washington agrees on. Maybe not the rest of the country, but everyone in Washington. So there's still a lot of anxiety about that, although Diane was noting that it's not even close to a done deal. It's not clear where the White House exactly stands on it, although they're certainly encouraging some semblance of talks. There's a separate narrative out there that Politico drove, saying that the president was being very cagey and setting an entitlements trap for the Republicans. He wasn't going to lead with a Medicare Social Security deal. The Republicans are in such a lather about the subject that they'd have to put something in their budget in the spring. They're the ones that end up going first, and they'll get knocked around for it. And Rich Lowry at the National Review raised a warning bell about that, which was flagged by Ed Kilgore, the Democratic strategist. Rich Lowry said, the public opposes cuts in Social Security and Medicare, and most Republicans did nothing to signal on the campaign trail that they would do anything to touch them. Most of them ran against Obama's Medicare cuts. So he was suggesting that the Chris Christie give it to a straight mood is sort of ahead of the game, leading with your chin. Lowry went on to endorse us all on Medicaid, which is focusing mostly on poor people. Thought that would be safer ground for Republicans to attack. But Ed Kilgore writes, in a context where polls like Chris Christie and others are loudly trying to shame Republicans into expressing the courage of their actual convictions on Social Security and Medicare, such tactics may ring hollow both within and beyond the conservative movement. So they may be in a tricky situation there.
Yeah. Reforming entitlements is still, in so many ways, the third rail. And Republicans have very fresh memories of what happened to the Bush administration when they came off that 2004 election and they were riding high and they immediately went to tackle Social Security reform. And it ended very badly for Republicans, sort of like set off this chain reaction of events that led to Republicans being in the political wilderness for a long time. So, but I think folks are going to clamor for presidential leadership on this. And I think, going to the Senate deal, I agree that it looks like I'm not confident something's going to happen. Joseph Lawler at the American Spectator has a post to the emerging Senate deficit deal, where he says, just as with the Bowles-Simpson recommendations, the political prospects and policy worth of this possible plan depend on the particulars. Most important, of course, would be the changes to Medicare and Medicaid. Not only are those the most important programs for fiscal reform by a wide margin, but they also leave little room for agreement between Republicans and Democrats. And he goes on to mention the Ryan Rivlin plan, and then says, but Rivlin doesn't have the same priorities and constituencies that, for instance, Dick Durbin has. It's hard to imagine what would have to be bargained away in order to get the final vote of a senator like Durbin. So this is sort of like a conservative, heads up that while a deficit deal may sound nice, that in order to get the votes that they'd need, it may come at the expense of, trying to win over the Dick Durbins of the world, and that in order to get Dick Durbin to support your legislation, it's not likely to be something most conservatives would probably like. So we'll see.
It comes down to how serious are you about the subject. I mean, there are a lot of folks on the left that say, "Look, this deal does not need to be done. Mm-hmm. We're not in a Greece-style crisis. The crisis now is jobs, and that requires more spending, not less. And you don't want to deal with the long-term deficit issues until you get unemployment down to, say, 6-7%. So Democrats are happy, or a lot of liberals are happy to play for a no-deal situation. Conservatives who keep saying that we're on the verge of a Greece-style meltdown, I mean, I don't see how you get from there to no compromise, no concession on conservative principles. If you have this imminent danger that we're facing, you would think you would compromise any which way to avoid that from happening, unless, of course, that's not really the concern that conservatives have. They just want to have another reason to, have cuts and not entertain things like tax increases.
Well, there's a funny quote at the end of the post from the Commission's co-chairman, Alan Simpson, who says that, quote, "Whether we get 2 votes or 18," this was back when they were trying to pass the report. "This baby ain't going away. Oh, sure, it may be buried in an unmarked grave soon, but when the votes for the budget and to extend the debt limit and the debate comes up in the spring, this cadaver will rise from the crypt."
Well, Simpson keeps saying things like that. This is a post that I wrote a couple weeks ago. He seems to be in a little bit of his own world. I mean, he put out a plan with Erskine Bowles that did not generate any public support. It was polled up and down by several different organizations, and its main provisions were rejected by the public, which is one of the reasons probably why the president did not embrace them wholeheartedly in his State of the Union address. So they keep operating under this fiction that they have brought together the middle of the country behind this glorious deficit reduction proposal, but the middle of the country is rejecting that plan.
Well, I think the big problem is that Republicans need to deal with is, like, we can either fix this now with some painful solutions, but we'll begin fixing it, or we can wait until it gets really bad, and then we're not just going to be talking about getting rid of the mortgage deduction in order to generate a little more revenue but lower, we're not going to be talking about these like little, I mean, I don't want to say these are little changes, but we're going to be talking about something much bigger and much uglier if we don't do something like this now. And I think both parties are going to have to figure out a way to sell this, but it's tough to sell pain, and I think that unfortunately I think that we are headed into a fiscal disaster, and so I hope that one or both of the parties can figure out how to sell a solution to get deficits back in line.
Speaking of selling pain,
Chris Christie.
Well, I was going to go Scott Walker.
Oh, okay, yeah, he's doing it too.
So we have high drama in Wisconsin. So Scott Walker, like Chris Christie, seems to primarily blame all of our nation's ills on public employees. And so the first thing out of Scott Walker, brand new governor of Wisconsin, been in office for I think 6 weeks. First major agenda item is to essentially strip public employees of collective bargaining rights, as well as
that's not what he's doing.
How are conservatives describing that?
Well, what they're doing is they're changing collective bargaining rights so that it doesn't deal with benefits; it only deals with wages, and they're putting in requirement that people have to pay
big stripping.
That they can still collectively bargain on their wages. It's the idea that you want to reduce the power of a public sector union, because the way that public sector unions are set up is it's a system that is inherently screwing the taxpayer. There's a quote from an Ace of Spades by Drew M., where he gets hardcore and he says, "Public employees should not be allowed to unionize, or if they are, they should be forbidden to contribute to political campaigns. The current system essentially allows the employees to buy off the managers, politicians, in order to rip off the owners, the public. It's a system that is corrupt by its very existence." Now that's harsher, and that's not even what they're trying to do in Wisconsin.
If you can't bargain for your benefits, you can't bargain. That's not an insignificant part of your compensation package.
No, it's not an insignificant part, which is part of the problem in these states where they're running bankrupt. And it's not because wages are necessarily bankrupting the states. It's because people they haven't had to pay into their pension, they haven't had to pay for their health care, and so that's what's creating this crisis. And now you've got these really angry protesters, which conservative blogs are now quick to point out. Molane at redstate.com says the Wisconsin GOP has put together a quick video of the attacks on Governor Scott Walker, which include signs calling him a Nazi and a dictator generally, signs calling him a rapist, and signs calling for his death. And that Scott Walker's call for limited reforms of Wisconsin's frankly out-of-control collective bargaining system for public sector union employees has caused a good deal of controversy, and by controversy, I mean death threats. That, like, in response to a reform to how the unions deal with the state, which you can argue on policy merits, that there's now this complete chaos in Wisconsin with, like, teachers leaving classrooms and bringing their students with them to protest. There's some, I mean, sad but funny videos of students being asked, like, what they're protesting for, and they're like, yeah, to get the guys to stop doing what they're doing. You know, like, I don't know. I think that, it's one and I think it's great to, like, go, you know, if you want to speak your mind, go speak your mind, but you also have a situation where the Wisconsin Democratic legislatures have left the state. So that's another development that has occurred in this situation. I'm interested to hear, this has obviously gotten a lot of play in the conservative blogosphere. Has the left started to, like, pick up in solidarity yet?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
You have folks who are live blogging there. Obviously, a lot of the premises that you articulate are not shared by folks on the left.
I'm sure.
There is certainly an argument that the public workers are not to blame for whatever pension issues that exist. A lot of these pension issues in many of these states are overblown to the extent there are problems. It's healthcare costs, which are a nationwide issue, not a public worker issue. The Wall Street crisis impact a lot of pension investments. And in certain states, you have states like New Jersey, which just literally didn't put money in the pension fund, which is not the workers not contributing, it's the state not contributing. So there's a sense that the public employees are being scapegoated for the problems and the failings of others. The fact that you've had this great galvanization in Wisconsin. John Nichols at The Nation, writes, enthusiastically, Wisconsin crowd swelled to 30,000. Key Republican legislators waver. Brilliant at breakfast, a sleeping giant awakens in Wisconsin. Think Progress, noted the folks in the Green Bay Packers were rallying to the side of the public employees.
They
There's.
must be right. They're Super Bowl winners. Sorry, I don't mean to belittle it.
I've heard weaker arguments before. So there hasn't been, the left hasn't had a sense of activist success in a while.
Mm-hmm.
They do feel, a lot of folks feel marginalized by the compromise the Obama administration has made, and so this, it's a little fresh. These protests were just happening yesterday, but I think you're getting a sense that this is a bit of a rejuvenating fight for the left to have, because the proposal that Governor Walker has is so harsh, so one-sided. No attempt. There's not even any. All talk about let's have transparency and debate and committee hearings. Yet none of that's happening in Wisconsin. They're just ramming the sucker through, we'll obviously where this comes down, how folks will feel at the end of the day, depending on who wins. But there isn't a lot of talk of compromise at this point. If Scott Walker wins the day, the Democrats are hauled back into the legislature, and the Republicans have the votes lock, stock, and barrel. That might be deflating, but if they're able to stand up to the governor here and show that, get the rest of Wisconsin upset about this, and if these Republican lawmakers are actually wavering, that could be a serious blow to Walker's political capital and make the left feel like we have people power again. I think certainly the blogosphere is doing what its part in trying to spread the word about this and make it feel like a real serious, grassroots event.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me is that there's this constant classification of whenever someone makes an argument and says, we need to reform the way that collective bargaining happens, or we need to reform the way that folks contribute or don't contribute to their pensions. That it winds up like, I think the Obama administration, there was a quote from him today saying, you know, we need to not make this about how public sector employees are the bad guys. And I mean, at least in my opinion, I don't believe that public sector employees are morally better or worse than, you know, as individuals, as human beings, you know, especially teachers in the classroom doing hard work. I think that's fantastic. I just think we ought to reform the way that the government deals with them, especially in situations where public employees have to join a union because it's not a right to work state, and then that money can then be used for political advocacy. That's just like that is a broken system.
But those are very separate issues than is this pension fund solvent?
But I think you can make the argument that there are needs to reform this situation that don't immediately make you someone attacking union members or attacking teachers. And it's often that's the argument that like sort of hyperbolically comes back, like, you're just hating teachers and you hate students. And I'm not saying you didn't make that argument, but like that's something that I kept reading a lot that was like, wow, that was a conclusion that was not there.
But as far as this specific, I mean, one, read Chris Christie's speech from AI yesterday. I mean, he's literally attacking kids directly and reveling in it.
Well.
And secondly, when you have a proposal which is, I am going to take away your current rights to negotiate your benefits packages. I mean, I don't know how else you interpret that but an attack. I mean, it's not a compromise. You know, we have a situation. This is not terribly well known because in a lot of states, you know, public workers are the pressures on them. But there was a pension issue with Vermont teachers, and the governor sat down with the Vermont Teachers Union. They hammered out a compromise, and they said, okay, we're going to raise the retirement age. You're going to put more employee contributions, but you'll get a bigger pension payout when you do retire. And overall, that's going to save the pension fund. I think it was 10%. You know, there was no demagoguing and there was no attacking. They sat down, had a negotiation. It was fine. I mean, these things can be done. They happen all the time.
And there's certainly an argument that Scott Walker has possibly, you know, politically handled this the wrong way to have set off a firestorm. That's completely an argument to be made that this was not handled properly. But I think that overall, the idea that something needs to be done in many states and many localities across the country to deal with this, I think this is very serious. And the idea that folks shouldn't have to pay into their pension funds or shouldn't have to pay for their health care. I mean, I think those days are gone. And that this may be like a last stand there in Wisconsin, you know, as the tide sort of turns and we realize we have to reform. I have one sort of fun thing. I'm going to read you about a candidate. And I want you to tell me who you think this candidate is. This is from a post by Josh Barrow over at The Agenda, which is at National Review. And I'm going to take the name out. He's the only candidate in the race saying that they must cut pension benefits and that current employees will earn in the future, not just benefits for new employees. He wants to take the charter model beyond education to other agencies of government where services could be improved with more bureaucratic autonomy, and if the experience with charter schools is any indication, less influence. Someone who is not a fan of not beloved by public employee unions. Who do you think the candidate is?
Jerry Brown, Andrew Cuomo, Barack Obama. Who is it?
No, it was Rahm Emanuel. You ruined my joke. You took the wind out of my sails right there.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, no, but the post then goes on to say, like Andrew Cuomo in New York, Emanuel is seeing that the math for business as usual with public employee unions just doesn't pencil. Now, this isn't the only controversial thing that Scott Walker has done. You've got, along with John Kasich and Rick Scott, those are three governors that turned down federal grants for high-speed rail funding.
And Rick Scott is the other big conservative governor news of the week.
Yes, that he's someone who, I mean, if you look at opinion polls, it shows that most voters in Florida aren't sure what to make of him yet because he's relatively new. The biggest complaints, or one of the biggest complaints you'll read, is that he's not giving the media enough access, but that really hasn't started to resonate yet. What this is something that's a real political risk for a governor to take. I mean, that federal money's not just going to go back to taxpayers. Like, we're not going to get a check like, oh, thank you, Rick Scott, for sending that money back. All Americans get their money. You know, that money's...
And you're saying we because you are still a Floridian at heart.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Well, yes, I live in Washington, but I'm connected to Florida. I'm from Florida.
Sorry, so are you a John Micah Floridian or are you a Rick Scott Floridian?
Well, no, I mean, I like that Rick Scott is sticking to his principles. You know, I mean, if you want to say that you don't think that the federal government should be funding big, expensive boondoggle projects that could put the state at risk, I think good for you. I mean, but then again, I also see John Micah's perspective, where it's...
Micah, by the way, is the U.S. House Transportation Chair, who's far more infrastructure friendly than most of the Republicans.
Yes, and so he was the Republican. There was a meeting Senator Bill Nelson held where he brought the Democratic legislators together and said, like, let's find a way to get this money anyways, even though Rick Scott has rejected it, and that Micah came to the meeting a little bit late. So it was technically a bipartisan meeting.
And Micah's not supporting Rick Scott on this high-speed rail decision.
In one sense, if you're going to be the sort of governor who says, I'm all about fiscal responsibility, I don't think we should be spending money on these boondoggle projects, there are other better things the money can be spent for, you sort of have to reject the money. I mean, this is similar to what, like, Mark Sanford did in South Carolina and saying he was going to reject stimulus money. I mean, that money doesn't just go back to taxpayers. That money would then get rerouted other places. So it is, in many ways, a philosophical stand. It's not... It in and of itself is not like saving taxpayer money. The arguments that Rick Scott is making on the end of, okay, you're going to start building this, it's going to wind up costing more than they think it is, and Florida taxpayers are going to be on the hook for it. Those are arguments that make sense for why this is better for Florida, but it is a risk. I don't know how many folks would really use a rail system between Orlando and Tampa, except Tampa residents who want to go to Disney. Or Orlando residents who want to go to Busch Gardens. I mean, I don't think that Florida is really ideally built for a commuter system like that. So I don't know to what extent Floridians will be really upset about it. But anyways, sorry for the Florida digression.
But there's certainly a blog commentary on the left about this, including my own. Keep in mind, they're killing a Tampa to Orlando link, but the link was not the end of the system. Mm-hmm. This is going to be eventually going to be a larger Florida system, go all the way down to Miami. It would be connected to the president's nationwide high-speed rail vision. Just the Tampa Orlando link was the most shovel-ready link that in the nation, mm-hmm. where the eminent domain they had the right of way, and they were able to move. There was hope that it could have been literally up and running by the end of a second term of President Obama. Of course, now that would happen unless they can find a way to work around the governor. Mm-hmm. To the point about is Rick Scott sticking to conservative principles on this, well, you have folks like at the Transport Politics saying, this was not putting Florida taxpayers at risk because the projection showed that even though the state would be responsible for the operating costs, they would have to pay the upfront costs for the construction. They'd have to handle the operating costs, but the projections showed they were going to make money on the operation, so it would not cost taxpayers money. Robert Cruikshank, who mostly known for blogging at Calitix, a California blog, but also has a separate California high-speed rail blog where he tracks these sorts of developments, noted there's always talk about potential for cost overruns and a threat that the state taxpayers will be on the hook for that. But he noted that the private companies had already indicated they would absorb any cost overruns because they think they're going to make money. This is intended to be a public-private partnership. It wasn't meant to be a strictly government operation. So they were going to make money off of the deal. And public-private partnerships are the kinds of things that Republicans tend to want to talk about when they talk about infrastructure. Mm-hmm. He is taking I'll agree with you that he's taking a political risk. I mean, that this was 24,000 jobs that weren't going to, at minimum, cost the state any upfront money. You can debate whether there'd be money down the road or not. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly, throwing that, in the wastebasket, while Florida has a higher than average nationwide unemployment. Their unemployment is at 12% right now. There's the blog post that I did on this subject to say, all I'm seeing from conservatives are ideas that would destroy jobs. I haven't yet seen an actual conservative idea since Republicans took over the House saying, here's our idea to create new jobs. I hear about Boehner saying, if we lose federal workers here, so what? If we lose high-speed rail systems, so what? If those are all the headlines, I think it'd be one thing if there was another plan in place that was designed to create jobs, but we still haven't actually seen that. No,
and you make a fair criticism of the sort of direction that House Republicans have taken. That it's been very focused on spending. I mean, these are the issues that they're having to address right now with the continuing resolution and the budget and the debt ceiling. But in an analogy I think that I've used on here before and that I'll continue to use again, I mean, the economy, the unemployment rate is the house on fire. And so as long as we are not putting it out and we are doing other things that are like, painting the house, changing the carpet, we're not doing what we need to do. So I would agree with you that Republicans need to put something out there that is a job creating package. And maybe that's a lot of the things that they're already doing, and then they need to explain how reduction in spending would create jobs. You know, if they're going to say that these are their policy principles, well, then they need to connect them. So I'll agree with you on that. The Republicans need to do a much better job of making that argument, because I'm not really hearing it at all.
Oh, and what I find strange is, and the transport politic, raised this point. Infrastructure, historically speaking, has been a bipartisan effort. There was sort of a sense, even if you have disagreements on how big the role of government should be, most folks understand that infrastructure is not going to get built by the private sector alone. No private company is going to build an airport. That's what governments do. No private company is going to build a road. That's what governments do. But you can talk about how is that funded, and to talk about public-private partnerships and try to limit the role of government in that process would be normally a meeting of the minds. And that's sort of the way John Micah seems to generally look at it. So, I mean, if you're a conservative, and obviously the bulk of your ideology is that the government should do less, and it's not the government's job to create jobs, that we should get out of the way, but you want to be able to give something to the public so it doesn't seem like you're completely out to lunch. It would seem like infrastructure would be a natural place to find common ground, but as the transport politic pointed out, the whole issue, the Republicans have chosen to make it a polarizing issue. The president's for high-speed rail, so we're going to be against high-speed rail.
Well, going back to the Florida example, and I only bring this up because this is the example that I know better, is that the idea was that the high-speed rail itself wasn't really going to create that much of an economic benefit for Florida, whereas you could do things that were cheaper. Like, for instance, they want to dredge the port of Miami so that you can get bigger boats in, so that it's a little bit deeper, and so that it can become a stronger economic center. That's something that would have been, I think it would have been like $75 million, which sounds like a lot, but compared to, the other numbers that we're talking about here, $75 million is just a drop in the bucket. And so that's something that would have definitely created an economic benefit very clearly, but that did not get, that was denied the opportunity to be funded. So, and it's sort of like an interesting piece of synergy. Red State, Blogger Strife, and the Washington Post editorial board sort of seem to be in agreement on this. He writes on the Post, last week we covered an Obama regime winning the future moment, their shameless boosterism of high-speed rail as though our national future depended on it, even though the regime has proposed to flush another $53 billion into what can only be described as a vanity project from hell. It appears common sense it has taken control. 3 governors, Rick Scott, Scott Walker, and John Kasich, have opted not to take federal grants for high-speed rail. Surprisingly, the Washington Post's editorial board, who, to the best of my knowledge, has never come out against federal spending for any public works project, pans the idea. And
I don't know if that's quite an accurate characterization of the Washington Post editorial board.
Pardden?
I don't know if that's quite an accurate description of the Washington Post editorial board.
That's debatable, and I don't have the knowledge to assert if this blogger is correct or not. But what is true is that the Washington Post editorial board does go through and says, quotes like, for instance, but for all the reasons to build high-speed rail in the United States, keeping up with the international Joneses may be one of the worst. In fact, experience has repeatedly raised questions about the cost-effectiveness of high-speed rail, and then mentions that when it comes to high-speed rail, Europe, Japan, Taiwan have natural advantages over every region of the United States, with the possible exception of the Northeast Corridor. They have high gas taxes and high population density. If high-speed rail turns into a money pit under relatively favorable circumstances, imagine the subsidies it would require here. So I think that's the argument for why it may sound nice, but that there are other infrastructure projects that someone like Governor Rick Scott is asking for, and those aren't getting funded, but the pretty fast trains are.
I would take that sort of argument with more seriousness if, for example, in the U.S. House, I saw some other type of infrastructure project being proposed.
Fair enough.
I've yet to see.
Fair enough.
Let's just move quickly as we can on the Middle East. I don't want to take up too much of our fair blogging its audience's time. There's been a lot of ripple effect coming off of the overthrow of the Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak, with protests across the Middle East. Is there a theme to conservative reaction to this? Are they cheering it on? Are they saying, all is lost, Obama's lost the Middle East and the Muslim Brotherhood is going to reign supreme? Is there a unified theory about what's going on?
It's mostly sort of, it's tempered concern, I guess. The best summary post that I can find that I think sums up a lot of what I've been reading is from the American Spectator blog by James Antle, where he says, observers are arguing that instability in Egypt and the Middle East could cut against U.S. and Israeli interests in the region in the short term, but but contribute to an opening of those societies that will ultimately be better for the U.S. and Israeli interests than the stability that we had under authoritarian governments. And the question is, how long is the long term? Could things get so bad in the short to medium term that hoping for long-term changes may veer dangerously close to wishful thinking? The idea being that right now you now have the military in charge. We don't know what this is going to look like. This could look scary to U.S. interests in the short term. We don't know what the Muslim Brotherhood's going to look like. There's a post by Claire Berlinski where she really laments this notion that folks are saying, well, the Muslim Brotherhood might be moderate, really pushing against it and saying, no, Muslim Brotherhood is not moderate. Like, you know, there are plenty of people who are in Egypt who are very moderate. This could work out fine, but the Muslim Brotherhood itself is not our friends, no matter how much spin you try to put on it. So it's just sort of like tempered concern. Like, okay, now we're here, you know, nobody was really cheering for Mubarak to stay, but it's a sense of concern about, we don't really know how this is going to turn out, and we're worried it's not going to turn out very well in the short term.
It's not the same as the blogging a few years ago when there was the Orange Revolution and the Crimson Revolution and the Violet Revolution and the various post-Soviet republics.
Right. Well, because there wasn't a sense that the devil you know versus the devil you don't. I mean, there's a sense here that the new folks coming into power there wasn't really a sense that after the Orange Revolution, like, the new people taking power were going to be potentially very opposed to U.S. interests or opposed to the interests of our allies, whereas there's real concern that this could go the wrong direction.
Well, I think most of the blogging on the left on this is far more squarely on the side of the protests, including Iran, although I'm sure the conservatives are not necessarily bagging on the Iranian protests.
No.
And there's a lot of excitement about Nick Kristof, the New York Times, going to Bahrain and tweeting from there and getting webcam shots, because obviously the more this stuff can be seen on television on Al Jazeera, the better chance these protests have to succeed and make it harder for there to be violent crackdowns. News Hoggers had a good roundup of Nick Kristof's tweets. But you're having some pushback on the left that Obama is not playing a strong enough role. At Fire Dog Lake, the blogger Sion had a headline, Iran's hypocrisy matched by Obama and Clinton, because they haven't been as forceful about the Bahrainian protests, because Bahrain is an American ally. They are saying that we are telling the Bahraini government to push for reform and not be behind the curve. But obviously, there's a difference in their rhetoric and their rhetoric, towards Iran. Mm-hmm. So there is some lingering suspicion on a part of the left that Obama is not being consistent when it comes to democracy in the region. There's still debate on the left how well Obama handled Egypt. I had a post myself praising Obama's handling of Egypt and saying it had a distinct break between past American narrow self-interest foreign policy, but there's others on the left that don't see it that way and see Obama as hedging his bets. Having said all that, Juan Cole, who I know is not the conservatives' favorite foreign policy blogger, did have a post saying, yes, there would be a loss to American interests, at least in the short run, if Bahrain fell. This is a different situation than Egypt. You have a Sunni dictator ruling a Shia people. They wouldn't be direct allies with Iran, but they certainly have warmer relations with Iran than currently. We have a naval base there. They could very well shut that down. I don't know if he was taking as far as saying we shouldn't support the protests there, but he was trying to be realistic about it and saying this is what a lot of the immediate impacts to American interests would be. Mm-hmm. And then that just raises the larger question, do you accept those blows to your short-term interests, thinking that if the region was more democratic, it would really knock the wind out of Al-Qaeda? They would lose their basic recruiting tools because the people would be enfranchised and would not feel a need to turn to a terrorist organization mm-hmm. to achieve political power. It seems to me that's what the Obama administration generally believes, and if they implement that in a nuanced way, that seems to be their general view. But obviously there are other folks on the left that don't agree with me on that.
Yeah, and I would say that I don't think there's too much daylight between what you just said and what, I think conservatives in general that I've been reading have slightly more reservations, but it certainly wasn't as though there was a great deal of like, oh man, Mubarak's gone and they are pushing for democracy. Shucks, like there was none of that. I mean, but it's a sense of like of the folks who are really cautious about this. Like let's not break out the champagne. This sounds great. Democracy sounds great. Let's see how it turns out in practice.
It's not quite whiskey, sexy democracy, is it?
Oh, gosh.
Oh, the blog memories.
Oh, my.
Well, always good to talk to you, Kristen.
Always good to talk to you, too, Bill.
So I guess I'll see you, I think, in 2 weeks.
Okay.
And we'll see Matt next week. Perhaps Matt will be ensconced at the Daily Caller by then. He's leaving AOL.
This is
Politics
what I hear.
Daily.
He's fleeing Ariana Huffington. I'm just kidding. I don't think that's what he. Well.
Actually, that's literally what he said.
Oh well, no. I mean, that is technically what he's doing. I don't know if I was. Anyway. All right. Have a good week, Bill.
You too. Take care.